Thank you very much. Professor Frank Lichtenberg is a distinguished economist and author of New Zealand's first examination into the impact of new medicines on New Zealand cancer patients. Professor Lichtenberg lives in New York. In fact, he's a native New Yorker. He's Professor of Business at Columbia University, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the Centre for Economic Studies Research Network. Our guest received a Bachelor of Arts with Honours in History from the University of Chicago and a Master's and PhD in Economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Lichtenberg has taught at Harvard University, served as an expert for the Federal Trade Commission, the United States Department of Justice, and State Attorneys General, and has testified before Congress amongst a long list of other positions and appointments. These are pretty good credentials. But in case Frank is sounding like life is all work and no play, I can tell you that he's also a keen runner, cyclist and tennis player. And this isn't his first visit to New Zealand. He did visit many years ago with his wife. They recently completed a cycle tour in the Lakes District, and I've done my best to sell him on our own Central Otago rail trail. We've kept him pretty busy while he's been here, and he's got a few more appointments to do yet, and some of you may have seen him on the Paul Henry show this morning, where he gave a bit of an indication about the presentation he's going to give tonight. We've also tried to sort of indulge his other interests of fine dining and wine by introducing him to a few fine New Zealand wines, and hopefully there's a few yet to come, Professor Lichtenberg. But back to work. Some of Professor Lichtenberg's acclaimed research has examined the impact of pharmaceutical innovation and has consistently found that new medicines improve survivability rates, reduce mortality rates, and decrease costs elsewhere in healthcare systems and broader economies. So we're very much looking forward this evening to the presentation of your research into the impact of pharmaceutical innovation on New Zealand cancer patients. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Frank Lichtenberg.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, and thank you, Minister, for your remarks as well. So I've been studying biomedical innovation from the point of view of an economist for a while, and I believe that as a result of biomedical innovation, 70 is the new 60, 80 is the new 70, but 90 is still 90. Apologies if there are any 90-year-olds in the audience. So I have been studying in particular cancer in a number of countries, including the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Belgium, and elsewhere. And I think it's a very important disease, and obviously there's been a huge amount of innovation in this area. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the research that I've done on New Zealand. And the headline is that new medicines have helped people with cancer improve their chance of survival. Between 1998 and 2010, the 5-year survival rate for all adult cancers increased by 5.6 percentage points. There's been an even greater increase in the survival rate for childhood cancers, such as leukemia. And my study indicates that in the absence of new cancer medications, the 5-year survival rate for all adult cancers would not have increased. We would have really seen no change, and perhaps even a slight decrease, but that turns out not to be statistically significant. So I think that the principal reason why cancer patients live longer today than they did 12 or 15 years ago is new cancer medications. However, not all cancers have been impacted equally by new medicines. We see very different rates of increase in survival and mortality from different types of cancer. And in fact, it's that heterogeneity that allows me, I believe, to identify what the effect of pharmaceutical innovation has been. For example, the 5-year survival rate for prostate cancer has increased by 9 percentage points, whereas the 5-year survival rate for Hodgkin lymphoma has only increased by 1.5 percentage points. Now, survival rates are subject to a critique. Epidemiologists are familiar with so-called lead time bias. That is, if people are diagnosed earlier, they appear to live longer, and that could be an artifact. That's why I don't focus exclusively on survival rates in my analysis. I also look at premature mortality rates, which are not conditional on diagnosis and not subject to lead time bias. But what I find is that the increase in 5-year survival rates in New Zealand is strongly related to the number of new cancer medications that, put simply, if you think of kind of high innovation cancers and low innovation cancers, the largest increase in survival has been for the high innovation cancers. When I estimate my econometric model, I find that funding or access to one new cancer medicine on average reduces mortality by about 5%. And also that one additional cancer medication for a particular type of cancer is associated with an even larger 5 to 6% reduction in hospitalization. And since I know that people are very concerned with the cost of cancer care, I think the latter finding is particularly significant. Far fewer New Zealanders are dying early in life as a result of new cancer medications. If we ask the question, how many life years were lost to cancer in 2011 in New Zealand, the answer is about 35,000. About 35,000 life years were lost due to cancer. My estimates, indicate that if there had been no new cancer drugs for 11 years, that actually the number of life years lost would have been about 10,000 higher. So instead of 35,000 life years lost from cancer, there would have been 45,000 life years lost from cancer. What that means that is, in essence, 10,000 people got to live one extra year in 2011 as a result of the new cancer drugs. And that's about, so premature mortality from cancer would have been about 29% higher in 2011 than it actually was, so that the counterfactual would have been much larger than the actual premature mortality. Now, once again, I think longevity is probably the most important benefit of cancer drugs, but there are other benefits as well. And I also find that if no new medicines had been approved during the period 1991 to 2002, the number of cancer-related hospitalizations in 2011 would have been about 23% higher, so that new cancer drugs have reduced the number of patients admitted to the hospital for cancer and their average length of stay. Now, hospitalization for cancer is about, the cost of hospitalization is about 4 times as large as the cost of medicines for cancer. I think that that's probably a frequently overlooked fact, so that even a relatively modest reduction in hospital cost would be sufficient to completely offset the cost of the medicines themselves. And in fact, on average, and this is an average across all of the new cancer drugs, the reduction in hospital cost for new cancer drugs, from new cancer drugs, is approximately equal to the cost of the cancer drugs themselves. So I think it's very important when looking at the cost of cancer drugs and medications in general to not sort of focus on these silos, on only looking at pharmaceutical expenditure. I think that we need to consider the overall healthcare costs, and that may not be done in practice. Now, what if we compare New Zealand to other countries? And I'll pick my own country, the United States. If we, in the United States, during an almost 30-year period, about 139 new cancer drugs were launched in the United States. In the same period, only about half as many drugs were launched in New Zealand. Now, it's possible that, that perhaps those 70 or so cancer drugs that were not launched in New Zealand, perhaps they were of marginal medical value. So that is theoretically possible. However, in my study, I try to address that by looking at U.S. mortality and its relation to the number of cancer drugs launched in the U.S. And what I can do is divide cancer drugs launched in the U.S. into two categories: drugs that were launched in both New Zealand and the U.S., and drugs that were only launched in the U.S. and not in New Zealand. And what I find is that in general, the medicines that were not launched in New Zealand were no less valuable in the United States than the medicines that were launched in New Zealand. So that is not consistent with the view that essentially that New Zealand only launched the valuable medicines and basically did not launch the medicines that were of low medical value. Now, what I focus on in terms of these sort of social investment aspects of pharmaceutical innovation in this study is I look at longevity and hospitalisation. Due to data limitations, I did not look at other factors such as increased productivity and reduced disability. But I have looked at that using US data, where we have, fortunately, very good population health surveys where we know how many people miss work and due to what medical conditions. And I have found using US data that the medical conditions for which there was the most innovation over about a 15-year period saw the largest reductions in work loss days, the largest reductions in school loss days among children, and also the largest reductions in disability, in government disability payments. So I think that there are kind of social benefits to pharmaceutical innovations above and beyond the longevity and hospitalization that I'm able to identify in New Zealand. But due to data limitations, I was unable to explore that using New Zealand data. So to conclude, and I hope we'll have a discussion and talk about these results after I conclude, new cancer medicines have been a highly cost-effective intervention that increased patient longevity, decreased hospitalization rates, and did not cost, on average, the New Zealand healthcare system money, and may have even saved money. Of course, the impact of new cancer medicines in New Zealand could have been even greater because, as I pointed out, only about half the medicines launched in the United States were launched in New Zealand. Moreover, the access lag in New Zealand seems to be rather high. In the United States, it seems that new cancer drugs reach their peak utilization within about 5 years. But the data indicate that in New Zealand, it takes perhaps 10 to 15 years for new cancer drugs to reach their peak utilization. And I do find that, in fact, it takes about that long for the launch of a new cancer drug to have its maximum effect on longevity. And so I think that that cancer patients could receive the benefits earlier, and we could see earlier reductions in mortality if there were a faster uptake of new cancer drugs in New Zealand. I think Medicines New Zealand has the complete study, which is about to be submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, and you can contact Medicines New Zealand to obtain the complete study, which is, by the way, I was assisted by Jenny Williams-Spence, who is currently working in cancer care in Melbourne, Australia. She is my co-author on this study. So I will stop there, and I'd be happy to have some questions and answers. Thank you.
Hematologist that works at the Wellington Blood and Cancer Centre in Wellington, and I've just been involved over the weekend in a myeloma summit meeting where we had some extremely prestigious visitors, Ola Landgren from New York, who is the principal myeloma director of the Cancer Centre at the MSK, and Paul Richardson from the Dana-Farber. Bortezomib, which has been a breakthrough drug in multiple myeloma, was funded by Pharmac in 2011. It was funded in the US in 2003. Paul Richardson was amazed it took so long to come. That has been the problem I've been struggling with. I've had 4 decades of looking after people with myeloma. When I started 40 years ago, the average survival was 2.5 years. We've managed to improve the survival to 7 and 8 years, and that is partly because we've been able to introduce novel agents. The problem in New Zealand is rationalisation by delay through Pharmac. I don't want to bag Pharmac too much. I work with them, they've been helpful. The problem is it takes forever to get novel agents into the clinic. If we'd been able to get some of these novel agents, there would be people living longer now. So I totally agree with your findings. Again, I use the example of myeloma. There's been 13 new drugs approved by the FDA in the last few years. None of these are available in New Zealand. We need the new drugs in the clinic. We need the monoclonal antibodies like daratumumab. We need the novel agents like lenalidomide up front. It is an issue. As a clinician, I struggle continuously with. It's quite difficult, and I totally agree with your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Actually, I published a study specifically about myeloma a couple of years ago, and that is a very interesting case because, in fact, there were no new treatments for myeloma for about 25 years. Nothing happened between about 1975 and the late 1990s, and since then we've seen an explosion in innovation, and that does correspond with a significant increase in outcomes. Also, I did do, part of the study looked at international data, and what I saw there was in the countries that adopted more of these novel agents, we saw greater reductions in mortality, so it's very consistent with that.
Hi, Letitia. I'm the CE for the New Zealand Organisation for Rare Disorders. I think one of your points about breaking down silos is a very important point. We struggle with some of the orphan drugs here and getting funded. Things like Myosome for Pompei's disease, where you can keep people out of wheelchairs, keep them active, keep them into working. Breaking down those silos is just something which these studies should be looking at and needs to be taken into account in the health sector.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could comment a little on capturing and measuring productivity, especially in the disease area of many cancers that are affecting individuals later in life, where perhaps the average age is 55 or above or even older, and how you capture that measurement of productivity where individuals are still wanting and able to contribute to life, or capturing the impact on social impact as well.
Yes, well, in the study I mentioned that looked at productivity or ability to work in the US, that was about innovation in general, not specifically about cancer. It is true that cancer is predominantly a disease of the elderly, and so, the issue of ability to work is maybe a little less relevant in the area of cancer. The way that I did measure it is we have a population survey where the government interviews about 25,000 people a year, asks them about their medical conditions, do you have asthma, do you have diabetes, et cetera, and also asks them how much, if they are employed, how many days of work did you miss as a result of your condition? So essentially, I was measuring disability days, the number of days that people reported being unable to work because of their illness or disability, and how that was related to the introduction of new drugs for those conditions. So that is one approach that I think can be taken. I'm not sure whether that would be feasible in New Zealand. I've been asking people whether are there population health surveys that would enable one to determine kind of disease-specific disability and how that's changed over time. I think that's probably what would be required to implement that approach.
I've had the benefit of participating in many of the meetings that we've had with Professor Lichtenberg, and one of the things that struck me is the conversations that we've had with a variety of people around the use of clinical trials to get the data to assess the cost-benefit of a variety of medications that we're looking at having funded. But there are other considerations as well, and I wonder if you might just elaborate a little bit on that, Professor.
Yes, well, I think that I hear a lot these days about the contrast between data from randomized clinical trials and so-called real-world evidence and big data and so forth, which would come from real-world claims data and so forth. By the way, all of my research is based on real-world observational data. Of course, both approaches, both clinical trial data and real-world data, have advantages and disadvantages. If you look at real-world data at observational data, obviously there's not random assignment, however, I try to overcome that potential problem by using aggregate data, as I did in New Zealand. So that gets around issues of non-random assignment or selection. But I think we recognize that data from randomized clinical trials may not map perfectly into experience in the real world. It's a different set of patients. There is greater adherence in a randomized clinical trial, and I have some work that I'm currently doing, including with colleagues in Denmark on diabetes, where we observe that patients are far more adherent to newer drugs than they are to older drugs. And so that might not be captured in clinical trials data. So I think that so-called real-world data has something important to contribute to evaluating the efficacy and cost-effectiveness of new drugs above and beyond what we get from randomized clinical trials.
Thank you. My name's Diana Safati. I'm at University of Otago, Wellington. I'm a cancer epidemiologist. Thank you for your talk. I was just wanting to enlarge the idea about de-siloing. You were talking about it in relation to sort of healthcare costs and healthcare benefits. But I also think it's important to think about that more horizontally, given that there is finite money in the purse. And the other question to ask is whether, if we're spending a certain amount of money, whether innovations in drug development is where we're going to get best bang for our buck. So I'm thinking about things like innovation in terms of prevention of cancer, innovations in terms of the way that we deliver care, de-siloing cancer care outside of other chronic conditions, and a whole lot of other strategies which may be more cost effective and may result in greater reductions in mortality, greater reductions in inequities between groups and all of those sorts of things. So just sort of thinking about de-siloing more broadly.
Yes, well, I agree that in principle, it's not just pharmaceutical innovation, but other kinds of innovation in delivery and so on that are potentially important. I mean, however, I would say that from the statistics that I've seen, the lion's share of research and development, of biomedical research and development, is concentrated in the pharmaceutical and biotech sector. That's where most of the R&D is, so I think that that's probably where most of the innovation is occurring. Other forms of innovation are important as well. In a couple of studies based on US data, for example, I've also looked at innovation in diagnostic imaging, that is the use of MRIs and CT scans as opposed to X-rays, and I have found that those also have made an important contribution to reducing mortality, albeit considerably smaller than the impact of new drugs. So there are measurement issues. The advantage of pharmaceuticals is that we can measure innovation reasonably well. We know when new drugs are launched, when they are used, et cetera. That is somewhat more difficult to do when we're looking at other kinds of innovation. But just because they're harder to measure doesn't mean they're not important as well.
Thank you. David Cunliffe. I'm the Labor Party's Innovation and Science spokesperson and a former Minister of Health 2 ago. We churn through them. The question I have is whether one of our takeaways from your socioeconomic cost-benefit analysis is that the aggregate level of pharmac funding, if we take the model as a given for now, if the aggregate level of funding does not properly take into account all of the positive externalities of pharmaceutical innovation. Or, you might say that's a vertical argument, or building off the previous question, is the issue around the horizontal processes within the pharmac model which are misallocating within budget, or both?
I would not pretend to be an expert on the pharmac decision-making. I would just emphasize that I think it is important when considering what the cost of new medicines to consider their impact on other medical expenditure. I think that those are often perhaps not captured in a clinical trial setting, whether patients are less likely to be hospitalized or length of stay is likely to be reduced. And therefore, there may be an incomplete accounting of other medical costs, which could conceivably, to the extent that that varies across drugs, that could result in a kind of a misallocation and so on. But I don't want to say that necessarily that pharmac decision-making is flawed for that reason. I would not necessarily reach that conclusion.
Should be on. Peter Shepherd from the University of Auckland. Does your model allow you to predict what might happen in the future with drugs that have been paradigm shifting, such as the checkpoint inhibitors for melanoma, which are not talking now about small increments in life, but actually curative? And secondly, does your modelling show any changes as drugs come off patent and become generic in terms of the efficacy on lifestyle statistics? Bearing in mind that one of the arguments here seems to almost be, let's wait till they come off patent and let's get them cheap.
Well, on the first question, in some of my studies, and even a bit in the New Zealand study, I do try to distinguish between kind of, quote, breakthrough drugs and follow-on drugs, sometimes pejoratively called Me Too drugs. Actually, in the New Zealand context and elsewhere as well, I failed to detect a difference. For example, one can ask, do outcomes depend on the number of drugs for a condition or on the number of classes of drugs or mechanisms of action? What I generally find is that it's actually the number of drugs, not the number of classes of drugs. If you think that once we have a new drug class, that having subsequent drugs within the same class will not make much difference, my data generally don't support that. It is having more drugs within existing classes is valuable, not simply having, it's not just the number of classes. I've also tried to distinguish, using FDA data, for example, between priority review drugs and standard review drugs. And in some cases, that makes a difference. In other cases, it doesn't make a difference. So it's not necessarily easy to detect. On your second question about generics and so forth, there also, I have looked at that, not specifically on cancer, but there the results are not so obvious because we might all expect, especially in the United States, where we do not have universal health care for prescription drugs, although we've moved a bit more in that direction. You might think when a drug goes off patent, the drug becomes cheaper, co-payments decline, and that should encourage greater utilization. But there's an offsetting effect there, and that has to do with pharmaceutical marketing. That when drugs are about to go off patent, companies stop marketing the drug. There's a significant decline in marketing, and marketing does have an effect on utilization. So although when prices go down, that would have a positive effect on utilization, when marketing goes down, as it does when drugs go off patent, that actually has an offsetting effect. And in a paper I published with a colleague a few years ago, we find that on average, the net effect of patent expiration on utilization of drugs is approximately zero, that we don't see much of a change in utilization in response to patent expiration. And so there's more going on than just a decline in price.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lichtenberg. There's plenty of food for thought there, and I'm sure that discussions will continue at tables as dinner comes out very shortly. Thanks very much for your time and also for the meetings that you're having with a variety of people. Professor Lichtenberg has already met with several people in the room, and there's other meetings scheduled yet. Thanks also to the Minister of Health, the Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman, for hosting tonight. It's great to have you here to be participating in these discussions with us. We really do appreciate that. And finally, I would like, on behalf of the board, to thank the Medicines New Zealand Secretariat, our General Manager, Graham Jarvis, and his team, Monica, Katie and Philippa, have done a superb job in putting tonight together and the program for Professor Lichtenberg. And these things don't happen by accident. When they work well, they work very well. So thank you very much, team. Enjoy your dinner and please stay. And I look forward to the discussions that I'm sure we're going to have next. Thank you very much.